is a seismic shift about to happen in the Middle East. This fall, Canada, the UK, and France are considering recognizing a Palestinian state. Moves that echo the growing momentum of European sentiment and follow last year's actions by Spain, Ireland, and Norway. And all of this is happening while Israel is locked in battle with Hamas and considering a dramatic step to end the conflict by fully conquering Gaza. What does this sudden shift mean for international law, diplomacy, and Israel's future? Is the push for Palestinian statehood a legal necessity, or a dangerous departure from decades of negotiation-based peace processes? On today's Basic Law, we'll dive into the legal and moral minefield that these new moves create. What does the recognition of Palestine really mean for Israel's diplomatic standing, particularly in the face of growing lawfare and the attempt to pursue peace regionally through expanding the Abraham Accords? Joining us to dissect these critical issues is Elliott Abrams, chairman of the Tikva Fund and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, one of America's foremost voices on Middle Eastern diplomacy. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Welcome, Elliott.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here. So, the UK, France, and Canada are just the newest ones to move in this direction of recognizing or conditionally recognizing a Palestinian state. They join actually most UN countries that have already done so. In your view, do these recognitions meet the international legal thresholds for statehood? And regardless, are they real in some way, or are they mostly symbolic?
Well, those are the critical questions. They certainly don't meet traditional international legal standards. Those legal standards require that there be a government in effective control of territory and that one be able to describe the territory. And I don't think the so-called state of Palestine meets either of those standards. Now, as you said, most UN members, most countries in the world have recognized the state of Palestine. I think the number is now in the 140s. If these additional three go through with it, it might be up to 148. And one question one can ask is, what difference has it made? First, let's talk about the legal part of it. It is, I would argue, a violation of traditional legal standards. And I must say, in my own experience, it's particularly interesting to watch the UK because the UK has actually traditionally been quite strong about maintaining the legal standards. And the lawyers in the Foreign Office have been very, I'm not sure what the right word would be in Hebrew, much less in English, but persnickety, let's say. You try translating that. That is, they've been very tough. They've been very tough on keeping those legal standards. And I can remember many negotiations with the British over all sorts of things, including war, where the lawyers have said, you cannot do this or that. And then they follow. In this case, it seems to me clear that the lawyers have either been silent or have been overruled. And the problem with it, of course, is that what's happening is that there now, henceforth, are no legal standards. You just recognize whoever you want to recognize whenever you want to do it for political reasons. And just turning to that for a second, one can ask, okay, 140 some odd states have recognized Palestine. Has it mattered? Has it mattered for the economy of, let's say, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza? No. Has it significantly, to now, has it significantly hurt Israel? Has it affected the life of Palestinians, the political life of Palestinians? And I think the answer is not much, because it is mostly, I'd say, symbolic. And it is a matter, certainly for the British, the French, it is a matter of domestic politics. And everyone knows it. So what has it done? Palestine now has an observer status in the United Nations. It is not a member state of the United Nations because the United States continues to veto its membership, which requires Security Council approval. It's a member of a number of UN agencies. One of the reasons the U.S. keeps getting out of UNESCO, well, under Republicans and then rejoining under Democrats and then leaving again under Republicans, full membership of the so-called state of Palestine. The question, I think, I would put it differently. I don't think that recognizing Palestine per se is very significant. What is significant, I think, is the overall turn of opinion in so many countries against Israel. I worry much less about the recognition of Palestine per se than I worry about, for example, trade relations. I worry about the possibility that this would lead in some manner over the next few years to countries in the EU, for example, cutting off trade to Israel, limiting trade to Israel, or limiting the other kinds of contacts that they have. Recognizing the state of Palestine doesn't require any of that, but it's just a step in the general hostility toward Israel. In fact, I just stop with this. The recognition of Palestine is actually not meant to help Palestinians and won't help Palestinians. It is meant to express hostility to Israel.
So you're suggesting that there's not going to be a lot of, let's say, tangible effect to recognition per se, but that it's a larger indicator of hostility toward Israel that may express itself in, among other things, trade relations. Could we just more carefully go, let's say, kind of piece by piece here and say, okay, on the Palestinian side, you think it doesn't make a huge difference? Does it make any difference at all? Does it put them in a worse position if it doesn't put them in a better one?
Theoretically, if Britain, France, Canada recognize the state of Palestine, there would be an exchange of embassies, for example. There would be a British, French, and Canadian embassy in Ramallah, though Israel may not permit that. There would be Palestinian embassies, full embassies, meaning with staff that have, full diplomatic status. The embassy has extraterritorial status. Probably slight advantage for the Palestinians in those countries, but their presence is, I think, sufficient, and the presence of pro-Palestinian groups is sufficient so that the incremental advantage to them is not great.
Okay, now, in terms of Israel, it sounded again like this is simply an indicator in a larger shift in the European approach. You mentioned trade relations could possibly be hurt. Are there other aspects that Israel should be concerned about, whether it's diplomatic or in, these international legal forums?
Israel conducts military activities and police activities in the West Bank. If you believe that that is a country called Palestine, then each of those activities, the entrance of an IDF jeep, is an act of war. And so are all your activities in Gaza. That is, you are invading another country. Although, of course, if you turn that upside down, that other country has committed acts of war against Israel by crossing your borders. The according of statehood status, diplomatic recognition, gives hostile governments a little bit of an additional excuse for going after Israel, for example, in the UN. But the key word, I think, is little bit, because so many of the countries are doing it now. And again, 140 some odd countries already recognize the state of Palestine. And it does not seem to have changed either Palestinian or Israeli conduct. The question would be whether when we're talking about countries with influence, such as the UK and France being an important member of the EU, does that change the formula? Does that suggest that in the future, this will become more prejudicial to Israel? My answer to that for the EU is, if the French were doing this as part of a campaign or as the first step in what they view as a forthcoming campaign of lawfare against Israel, that would matter a lot. I believe that Macron is doing this for domestic political reasons. Will he do more for those reasons? He's got an election coming. I've forgotten the date now, but what does it mean for Israel? I would think that you would want to review again who are your reliable friends in the EU, the Poles, the Czechs, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, whoever, to make sure that if the French do try to increase the volume here, there are others who are willing to stand up forcefully and reject those moves. Now, that's diplomacy. That's not law.
Well, they're somewhat intertwined these days. But you're correct. So I am curious as to how you think these declarations are driving decision-making in Israel's war in Gaza and more broadly for the Abraham Accords. But we're going to save that a little bit for, the rest of the show. We're talking about Britain and France in part. We've kind of forgotten Canada. But Britain and France are permanent members of the UN Security Council. They're one of 5 countries that hold a veto over resolutions in the General Assembly. The United States is Israel's staunchest ally there. Basically, if Britain and France do go forward with recognition, it's only the U.S. and the permanent members, I think, that hasn't recognized Palestine. So, what's the significance of that as you see it? Especially because, of course, views on Israel appear to be changing even within the Republican Party, let alone more broadly in the United States. How do you see the future of the American veto, and how should Israel think about it?
You have 3.5 more years of the Trump administration. So this is a medium-term problem rather than an immediate problem, but it is a problem. Is it conceivable that a future president, more likely a future Democratic president, would stop vetoing resolutions in the Security Council? We've actually seen that. The last resolution presented in the Obama administration, for example, which dealt with, as I recall it, the West Bank, should have been vetoed and wasn't vetoed. So that's a potential future problem, but less with respect to statehood. That is, one can imagine Security Council resolutions that would be damaging to Israel. For example, suppose you had a resolution that called on people, well, if it were a Chapter 7 resolution, it would mandate no arms sales to Israel, no trade with Israel. That sort of thing would be extremely damaging. And I think the United States would never, under any president that's really seriously conceivable, would not permit such things to pass the Security Council. If the state of Palestine were a member of the UN, not an observer, a full member, it would have certain rights within the UN system to be members of other UN bodies. But again, they are an observer. They do speak. They're there in New York. They have a delegation in New York. And it does seem to me that this is, again, this mixture of politics, diplomacy, and law, where this should more be seen as yet another form of diplomatic and political pressure on Israel, rather than the legal status itself being so powerful that it will change the way Israelis or Palestinians live.
So in terms of diplomatic or political signaling to Israel, in the past few days, we've had what may be partially a response to these international moves. I never discount the importance of domestic factors as well, but we've had a couple of big things happen, one of which apparently will be decided later today or tomorrow, which is that Israel has announced that it's going to militarily occupy the Strip. It's going to completely conquer it, which is something it's avoided doing for some time. And then this was less reported, but I think it's kind of in the same vein, was last week the Knesset approved a declaration in favor of the declaration of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. That was 71 Knesset members voted for that. And I'm wondering the extent to which you think that these kind of unilateral recognitions are driving Israel to be more assertive about its claims to territory, and whether they have a historical basis. Legal.
Well, they certainly have. They certainly have a biblical basis.
Legal, historical.
Legal, yes.
Yeah.
They have a legal basis in the sense that if we are looking back to the Palestine Mandate held by the British, one can make an argument that with the Arab side having rejected partition, with Jordan having abandoned its claims, or suspended, maybe the right word, its claims, that Israel has a right to conquer the territory. But I'm just speaking personally, I think that would be a significant mistake. I understand it politically, again, in terms of both domestic party politics in Israel and in terms of a reaction, almost an emotional reaction, against the pressures Israel is under now, the lack of support and comprehension from so many countries around the world. And, this reaction saying, oh, yeah, well, we'll show you, we'll absorb the whole territory. I don't think that's wise, but I'm not an Israeli. But it does raise the question then, okay, you annex the entirety of Judea and Samaria. How many Arabs live there? A couple of million, let's say, round numbers. What is to become of them? Who are they?
Well, this is the question that's kind of haunted the entire discussion for many, many years.
Exactly.
Right.
And still does.
I will say that as far as I understand it, I try to be humble about this, but as far as I understand, under international law, even a right to self-determination does not necessarily mean that the conclusion of that is statehood. Right. Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. Greenland has had stages where was initially a colony and now it's become, more independent under, I believe, Denmark. So
let's just take 1 second on that note, just to note the fraudulence of this claim that Palestinians have an absolute right to statehood. If you think of the determinants of statehood, we talked about this at the very beginning, a government, territory, no one has a better right to statehood than the Kurds. And 140 some odd countries have not supported their right to statehood and recognized them as a state. What about Tibet? What about Xinjiang? We can go around. What about the Basques and the Catalans? If we think about things ranging from culture to religion to language to history to a defined territory, there are many other claims that ought to take precedence over the Palestinian claim. The notion that the Palestinians have a right to statehood, I think, is on pretty flimsy ground, and is political rather than legal. And as you just said, self-determination takes many forms and lots of examples of it around the world, of limited sovereignty, let's put it that way. During the negotiations back in the Bush years, the Palestinians would sometimes say to us that They would never accept a deal where they had any kind of limitations on their sovereignty. And Secretary of State Rice would sometimes respond, what about the EU? Very significant limitations on sovereignty for any country that's in the EU. It is the explanation for Brexit. The British did not, in the end, like those limitations, and so ended them and left the EU. So the notion that it is obvious that Palestinians have a right to statehood, it seems to me, should be challenged right up front. Again, we're in a political situation where um, people don't want to hear that argument, but they should, because there isn't going to be, we can come to this later, but there isn't going to be a Palestinian state, certainly for a very long time. And everyone, I think, including Arab governments, understand that. So the alternative status of Palestinians is a very important question. It's an interesting question. And if Israel were to annex all the Palestinian territories, which again I think is a bad idea, it would raise that question. Well, what are they? Are they simply citizens of Israel the way people in Haifa are? Is this a new province or two of Israel? What is it? Anybody who is urging annexation should have a theory of the case, should be able to answer those questions.
Well, we were going to get to this later, but we're gonna get to it now because it's very hard to leave that hanging. But look, you've been a vocal criticism of the two-state idea for a long time, and you're not only right about, as far as I can tell, about the need to challenge the idea that a right to self-determination necessarily means statehood, but even the Oslo Accords did not necessarily conclude with a state. That was not supposed to be where they necessarily led. It was to some form of autonomous government following all sorts of steps that the Palestinian Authority never, or the PLO never took. So I would like to understand, given that you really have done work on this, how you see the future, both in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. And yes, it's not exactly a legal question, but it's very hard to have you on a podcast and not take advantage of it.
Well, let me say first that you're quite right in saying that Oslo said nothing about statehood, an independent state of Palestine. The term statehood is not anywhere in the Oslo Accords. And when, I guess it was 95, Rabin made his key speech to the Knesset about the Oslo Accords, he said, what we see is an entity that is less than a state. So the notion that Oslo leads inevitably to statehood was never built in to the Oslo Accords. It actually gets put in, I think, in the Bush administration, in the roadmap, which is 2003, where President Bush says, this is a performance-based roadmap to a two-state solution. So it becomes the U.S. position essentially 10 years after Oslo won. My own view is that we should go back to the beginning, which is to say 100 years ago. The key idea was partition. The key idea was that Arabs and Jews should essentially be partitioned into two things, two entities. And that idea would have created, or did create, a very small Jewish state, much smaller than had been desired or anticipated by the Zionists. Yet they accepted it. They accepted the compromise because they desperately wanted a state. The Arabs said no. And they said no to the Peel Commission in, 39? I mean, they have been saying no. They said no in 48, and they have been saying no. Initially, all the Arab states, more recently, fewer of them, but still the Palestinians, saying no to each offer. And my own view is that that is because they don't really want a state. a state was the fulfillment of the Zionist dream and program. It was never the fulfillment of Arab dreams. And the Palestinian dream and objective, I would say, before 48 and after 48 has been to prevent there being a Jewish state in mandatory Palestine. That is to say that Palestinian nationalism was and remains essentially negative. That does not describe every Palestinian. Let's take the example of Salam Fayyad. Fayyad actually said at one point, this is not a direct quote, but it's close. Israel was not created in 1948. It was announced in 1948 after decades and decades of the building of the institutions that then allowed it to be a functioning state. And Fayyad got 2.4% of the vote when he ran for the Palestinian parliament. That very constructive view of building a state by institutions over time, I think does not speak emotionally to the desires of Palestinians. Okay, if all that is more or less true, where are we going with this? What's going to happen? I don't think that Israel is going to allow the creation of a Palestinian state anytime in the foreseeable future, no matter who is prime minister. If one envisions an election next year in which another coalition defeats the Netanyahu coalition, whoever comes forward is not going to say, wonderful, now let's negotiate a Palestinian state instantly. I am in favor of partition. That is, I think there ought to be a Palestinian entity with the greatest degree of self-government that comports with the security of Israel and Jordan. The Jordanians are very concerned about a Muslim Brotherhood state, a Hamas state coming into being across the Jordan River. The question to me is, what is that entity? Now, those who want to annex Judea and Samaria seem to be moving toward the one-state solution. There's only one entity. I think that's a mistake for Israel, because as you think through what would be the status of those 2 million, and if you include Gaza, let's say 4 million Palestinians, there's no good answer to that. My own view, which everyone hates, but I would argue will come around to over the next few decades, is that it is possible to see a Palestinian entity with increasing amounts of self-government and autonomy, and having some relationship. It has to have some relationship with what I might call a real country. A country which would have to be Israel or Jordan. A country that has security forces, that has an international airport, that has an economy. So which is it? And my answer is, well, come on. Should it be a Hebrew-speaking Jewish state, or should it be an Arabic-speaking Muslim Arab state that's already half Palestinian? The logic to me is pretty obvious that it ought to be in some kind of confederation with Jordan. One of the old Palestinian leaders, Abu Iyad Salah Khalaf, once said that there must be a Palestinian state for 5 minutes. In other words, you have to let the Palestinians make that choice to confederate or join Jordan. If you ask the king about it, he'll have you thrown out of the country immediately today. But, you know, the relationship, even now, between Palestinians in the West Bank and Jordanians of Palestinian origin is pretty close. The economies are intertwined. More and more Palestinians use Queen Elliott Airport. And I think, by the way, that something that Israel should have done a long, long time ago was make it easier and easier and easier for Palestinians in the West Bank to go to Jordan and to turn to Jordan for things like travel and shopping and education. But that's my answer. In the long run, I think a truly independent Palestinian state is simply too dangerous. Palestinian nationalism, very unfortunately, was and remains fairly chaotic, negative, and violent.
Right. They're still, even now, funneling massive amounts of support to terrorism, including, I believe, murders from October 7th. So I appreciate that foray outside of the legal side, and I know it's opened up a whole new series of questions, but I'm going to pull you back, except for one thing that you mentioned earlier about how Palestinian statehood entered U.S. policy under Bush in the roadmap. So why? Like, how did that happen? If self-determination doesn't necessarily mean statehood, what were the considerations that caused that, and is it still an aspect of U.S. policy?
The world in general has seemed to accept this notion that, yeah, well, there was Oslo and then there were other developments, and they all lead to Palestinian statehood because it's the only and obvious outcome. The view, I think, was and remains there's no alternative. And I think it was the British Prime Minister recently said that there is no alternative. You can find several speeches by former Secretary of State Blinken. There is no alternative. I think that's been the view, and I think that was the American view. If you go back to Bush days, we've had Oslo, we've had further negotiations, then they were stalled. But there was kind of an inchoate sense that, well, of course it's all about statehood. What else is it about? There is no alternative. One of the problems of this whole discussion, there is no alternative discussion, is that very unfortunately, there hasn't been a good discussion of, well, actually, wait, why don't we see if there are any alternatives? Why don't we discuss that? Why don't we find out what public opinion is? Why don't we see what the modalities might be? That's basically not been done because people have accepted that this is a single track railroad. It has only one destination, and only extremists of left or right fail to agree with that. Terrorists, maybe, who want to destroy Israel, don't agree with it. Extreme right-wingers in Israel who don't want a Palestinian state, but every right-thinking person knows that this is the only outcome. I would say that's still the prevalent view in the US and in Europe and more broadly in democracies around the world. There is no alternative but the two-state solution. The only alternative, is war. I think that's still the view in Washington and elsewhere.
And what would it take to open that discussion? Because it seemed for a quick minute when Trump and Bibi came out, or President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu came out in a joint press conference a number of months ago, the read that many people had was that President Trump sort of surprised Bibi by talking about, let's say, voluntary relocation of Gazans and starting to develop the area. But there was a quick, I don't know, maybe it was a few weeks, a month more, where suddenly people were debating that idea, right? And the taboo was broken. I'm not sure if it's completely reasserted itself. It feels like maybe it has. But what would it take to really open a discussion? If I'm piecing together different parts of this conversation, it sounds like even the fact that this idea is considered the only possible alternative, it's not something that's grounded in good sense, in your view. It's not something that's grounded in international law. And it's perpetuating a situation where you can see what happened in Gaza when we tried to provide autonomy. We've come to where we are now. And you have the Palestinian Authority today in Judea and Samaria, which is highly reliant on Israel for its security, and which continues to rather openly support terrorism. So it sounds like there's an imperative to open this discussion if anything is to change. And then the question is, how?
It's a very hard question, I think, but it would have been easier clearly before October 7th. But now, I think you need a policy on the part of the government of Israel. It doesn't have to be declared policy, but to do what you're raising. That is a view that this would be advantageous to Israel to get this discussion going. And it wouldn't be that hard to get it going in the U.S. For example, there are a lot of Republican senators who I think would understand the argument and would be willing to start that discussion. If you think of the UK and France and Germany and Italy, there are parties in those countries, in some cases governing, in other cases not, that would, I think, be willing to engage in that discussion. And you don't even have to, in that discussion, foreclose a possible two-state solution someplace down the road. You just have to argue, look, it's not going to happen in the near future. We all know that. So the question becomes, what is the status of these territories? And, one could envision a certain degree of autonomy and then confederation with Jordan, and then 50 or 100 years from now, deconfederation with Jordan, a withdrawal to become an independent state. One can envision lots of different possibilities, I think. And again, it's been a really bad thing about there is no alternative view that it has prevented a reasonable discussion. Now, there's going to be a huge roadblock here, obviously, which is the Palestinian Authority is going immediately to say, we will not have that discussion, and it's illegal, it's illegitimate, it's part of the Israeli annexation view. Okay, they will say that, and I think you'll also get that from a very large number of governments. But it has the virtue of being, in my view, obviously logical to say, we have a problem, and we need to think about what is the best solution, even if you think it's an interim solution. It's 10 years, it's 25 years. I mean, when people say, the occupation is unsustainable, 1967 was a long time ago, and it's been sustained. And if we think about, well, we need an interim situation here that would last 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, that's significantly less time than the occupation has lasted. So, I guess my answer to you really is start. Let's start. Let's see if there can be a series of journal articles, political journals, legal journals, a conference in Israel, a conference in the U.S. About interim steps. I actually think that in the case of now I'm jumping to the Abraham Accords, but I think, just to give you an example, if you said this to the Emiratis in public, they would immediately denounce it and say, we are committed to the two-state solution. But I think that if you had this conversation with them privately and said, we're trying to think this through, you'd find a lot of Emiratis who privately would say, yeah, it's a real problem. What are you thinking about this? I even think that's true in the case of Jordan. And in my experience back in the Bush days, say 20 years ago, you could have this conversation at midnight over a scotch with the Jordanian official. This is a real problem. What are the alternatives? I don't think you're going to get people to drop their official commitment, but I do think it should be possible to start thinking about alternatives, even if you call them temporary.
Well, I mean, as you know, the forum doesn't take positions on this sort of issue, but in general, we do all that we can to give a variety of views a platform to really engage each other seriously. And I don't know that it's something that we can touch. We focus really usually on domestic Israeli legal questions. Have to think it over.
There are a million think tanks. And as I think about Washington, um, I can't remember a conference, a program on this subject of alternatives to the two-state solution. Maybe there have been, but, one could imagine for you or for, the Federalist Society, a program on the legal aspects of this question, others on the political or security or economic aspects of it. I can't remember that happening ever. And that's, I think, a mistake.
So I was going to say, I actually, you would know far more than I do. I had a few years in D.C. I think that reflected my more junior experience, but that it really does sound like an imperative. And I've always wondered why, speaking in a personal capacity, something that was clearly unworkable, seemingly, was being foisted on this population. And making, in certain ways, I think, their life materially worse. But okay, let me pull you back for a minute to recognition. Now that we've gone all over, there was I don't know that it was an American response to recognition per se, but there was a story last week that the U.S. State Department has decided to deny visas to members of the PLO and the PA for persecuting Israel in global legal institutions. Wasn't exactly clear which members or to what extent this prohibition is really new, but it was certainly announced because that persecution is in contravention of American law. Now, I ask you, as someone who's been quite involved in American diplomacy for a long time, Israel is looking at this challenge of recognition. It's looking at the challenge of persecution in these global institutions. Are there other things that the U.S. can do that would be in its own interest as well to help roll back this, this sentiment? What?
Yeah, the one you're referring to affects a small number of people, right?
Right.
It affects PA and PLO officials who are, bringing some kind of action in the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice. One of the things that we do domestically is prohibit actions that are discriminatory against Israel. For example, if a state government said no state employee can visit Israel, something ridiculous like that, that would be impermissible. The question, I guess, is how far one can go with respect to the actions of foreign countries. This week, I can't remember the exact date, but I think the Royal Ballet decided that it would not present Tosca in Tel Aviv. That's the kind of soft power move that reflects hostility to Israel, anti-Semitism. Could the United States, for example, penalize them? How would you do that? Could the United States say it would be a violation of law to participate with an entity that discriminates against Israel? So that the Royal Ballet would have had to think, well, we have this great tour of America coming, and we're going to have to cancel it if we cancel Tel Aviv. Why not? I think there are probably more things the United States can do to penalize groups, and very often this is going to be private or semi-private, semi-official groups that make these decisions, partly because, sometimes it's just out of hostility, other times is they don't want trouble. And the anti-Israel forces are very loud and sometimes violent. And so what we would be doing would be saying, yes, but you need to weigh something else in the balance, which is what you're losing in the United States. You cut off Israel, we cut you off. We haven't had to do very much of that because this hasn't been going on to the extent that it is today. I give you another example, universities. What if we said that American universities cannot have joint projects with universities that discriminate against or bar Israel? So that, again, the provost, the president, the dean would have to weigh the avoidance of trouble, the satisfaction politically of appearing to side with anti-Israel forces against the gain of participating with American universities. I actually think that we will move in that direction.
How would you frame that in terms of the American interest in doing that?
Well, how do we frame it now? We actually do bar boycotts against Israel, certainly domestically, but going back to the Arab oil embargo, there have been laws about against embargoes of Israel, and you would just pass a law and say that this violates the foreign policy interests of the United States. This harms the American position in the Middle East because it harms a strong partner ally of the United States. So you could probably do it now, now meaning this year or next year, because we have Republican majorities in the House and Senate. We have President Trump, and universities are, in any event, in the U.S., leery of such activities because they do not wish to encounter even more measures on the part of the government against them. And they don't want to encounter also pressure from American Jews against anti-Semitic or anti-Israel activities on their part. So this year, next year would be the time to do this. And this is the moment when I think we're likely to see more such moves. Some of them are almost invisible. That is, the Israeli competitor for a position is not chosen. It's very hard to prove that is because he or she was actually not the best. But the kind of thing that the Royal Ballet just did seems easier to understand and to penalize.
I'm not sure if it's the ballet or the opera, but no, for sure. Let me conclude with one question that you've raised for me throughout this conversation, because obviously this show has more of a legal twist, but we're talking about things where politics and diplomacy are implicated. And you keep correctly indicating which discipline we're really talking about. And very often it's much more political than it is really legal, certainly in these kinds of issues. So I'm just going to ask you, because you've had front row seat to so many really important policy decisions for decades. And I'm wondering how you see the legal versus political balance in, like, when you're talking about at the level of the presidency or the State Department, how they actually weigh those considerations and how that's changed over time, if at all.
That's a hard question. As a generalization, I think I would say that these decisions are much more political than they are legal. The legal question would be, when the lawyers tell you you must do a certain thing, you simply must do it. There is no alternative. And when do they say you can't? You absolutely cannot do this. It's pretty rare, I would say. More often the lawyers tell you, as any good lawyer does, even in a business context, civil context, how you must do something or how best to do it. There are times, here's an example, at the other end of the spectrum. The United States in the Reagan administration mined the harbors of Nicaragua. And the Nicaraguans went to the World Court And the World Court said, you may not do that. And the United States said, yeah, well, tough. There's only two circumstances in which you can do that. One is the situation of the United States, which is to say, very powerful. The other may be the situation of Israel, which is to say, life or death. There are things that the World Court would say that would cost so many Israeli lives that no Israeli government's going to do them. But for the most part, I would say we tried to do things. Another example, when Tony Blair came to President George W. Bush and said, my lawyers tell me that I need another UN Security Council resolution before I can join you in Iraq. Our view was you don't need it, but you think you need it. Your lawyers tell you you need it. So, okay. I think that's more typical that the State Department in our case and Justice Department lawyers are saying, this is the path to follow to get to where you want to be. Obviously, President Trump has much less patience with those arguments because he views the international legal system as essentially political, and I'd have to say I think he's basically right in that. If you look at the way the international legal system is twisted and torn to act against Israel, but this is mostly politics, and we just look at the way Israel is treated in the ICJ and the ICC, and in some cases in domestic law in other countries. And we look at questions like what is done by the security forces, mostly the police, to prevent actions against Israel and against Jews and against demonstrators for Israel. The law says this you may do, this you may not do. But of course, if it isn't enforced, then anti-Israel forces can do anything they want to do. So the decision when to enforce and when not to enforce, again, is political. I think that we are right to have this discussion of what does the law provide? What limits does it try to place on political figures as they make their decisions? But these are not fundamentally legal decisions for any head of government. They're fundamentally political. And when you decide, when you are, for example, the Prime Minister of the UK or the President of France, you're making your decision on completely non-legal grounds. And your lawyers may tell you, well, let us write the declaration so that it seems to fit. That's a political statement. And in the question of the problems Israel is having globally, or almost globally now, we're talking about politics. We're fundamentally not talking about law.
Well, next week's episode is going to ask similar questions about the domestic struggles that are happening between the political rungs and the legal system. We're going to be hosting a regular guest, Yaakov Ben Shemesh, to talk about the latest developments in the attempted dismissal of the Attorney General here in Israel, which is it's a very, very big deal. But it's interesting to me that in many areas of law now, it's not clear that it isn't much more political than it is law. And it's a problem that's really spread, it seems. I want to thank you for your time. I know that you joined us when it wasn't the easiest for you, and truly, truly appreciate it. I hope to speak again.
Happy to do it, and I hope it was a useful discussion.